Jackson was a rare genius in the field of science, yet he chose to give up the job he loved to stay close to his wife and children. Although this decision brought him a happy family, deep down in his heart, Jackson always regretted giving up his passion for research. Now, Jackson is just an ordinary university professor. One day, while walking on the street, his longtime best friend called him. The friend had just won a major award for his research and wanted Jackson to join in the celebration. The party was held at a bar near Jackson's home. After returning home from the bar, Jackson was suddenly attacked by a masked man. The man forced him to go to an abandoned factory on the outskirts of the city. Terrified, Jackson had no idea what the man's intentions were. When the masked man let his guard down, Jackson attempted to fight back, but he was no match for his opponent. The masked man quickly injected him with a drug that caused Jackson to lose consciousness. When Jackson regained consciousness, he saw many people in white uniforms cutting his clothes. As the effects of the drug wore off, and Jackson became fully aware of his surroundings, he realized he was being held in a secret laboratory. Everything began the day Ryan called to announce that he had won a major award. Most of Ryan's ideas came from a journal of Jackson's, where he had documented his research back in university. To express his gratitude, Ryan planned to invite Jackson to join the neuroscience company he had founded. With $100,000 in prize money now serving as capital for the company, Ryan's offer was enticing. Jackson was immediately intrigued, but hesitated upon learning that the company was located in another city. He wanted to consult his wife first. Torn between family and career, Jackson found himself in a difficult dilemma. As he wandered into a quiet alley, a masked man suddenly appeared, threatening Jackson with a gun and forcing him to drive to the outskirts of the city. The man also took Jackson's phone. To Jackson's shock, the man knew the passcode to unlock his phone. After reading through the messages, the man began asking questions about Jackson's current life. While they exchanged questions and answers, the car arrived at an abandoned construction site. The masked man ordered Jackson to remove all his clothes and jewelry, then forced him to walk inside the site. Jackson attempted to resist, but unfortunately, he was quickly overpowered. A syringe was injected into his neck, and Jackson felt his head grow unbearably heavy. Despite this, he forced himself to put on the clothes the kidnapper had prepared for him. He couldn't understand what the man's intentions were. The masked man cryptically said, "You can reclaim what you've lost." Jackson desperately wanted to see the face behind the mask, but he couldn't fight off the overwhelming drowsiness. When Jackson regained consciousness, he found himself in an unfamiliar room. Before he could make sense of what was happening, a woman with long hair opened the door. She introduced herself as Amanda and claimed to be a partner in one of Jackson's research projects. Confused, Jackson insisted that he had never met this woman before. Amanda remained calm, attributing his confusion to temporary memory loss. She then led Jackson to a meeting room where many staff members were standing outside the glass doors. Amanda explained that these were all contributors to the project. Jackson, however, only grew more bewildered. He had no idea what project they were referring to and struggled to understand what was going on. Amanda even mentioned that Jackson had been missing for 14 months and expressed a strong desire to know where he had been during that time. Touching the wound on his face, Jackson confirmed that his encounter with the masked man was real. That meant the scenes unfolding before him now were not hallucinations, but possibly part of an elaborate deception. At that moment, Jackson's only thought was to return home as quickly as possible. However, the person in charge insisted on conducting a comprehensive examination on him. Pretending to agree, Jackson seized the opportunity to escape midway. He dashed into an elevator and, after much difficulty, managed to reach the lobby. To his surprise, a security guard seemed to recognize him and even swiped a card to open the door, helping him flee from this strange place. But despite his escape, Jackson felt far from relieved. He hurried back to his familiar home, only to find Amanda already waiting for him there. She claimed that the two of them had always lived in this house together. Ignoring her bizarre words, Jackson called out for his wife while glancing curiously around. To his shock, he realized the layout of the house was completely different from what he remembered. Even more surprising was the prestigious Bavia Award trophy displayed on the bookshelf, an object he had no recollection of ever owning. This trophy was enough to prove his outstanding contributions to the field of quantum mechanics. Jackson even called his wife, but to his shock, a stranger answered the phone. If his guess was correct, Jackson had somehow crossed into a parallel world. In Jackson's original world, the masked man who had injured him finally revealed his face. To Jackson's astonishment, the man looked exactly like him. At that moment, the masked man had already donned the clothes Jackson had been forced to remove earlier. Walking into the kitchen, the man lovingly embraced Jackson's wife, Daniela, and said, "The wisest decision I ever made was giving up scientific research and marrying you." Jackson felt as if he had lost the most precious thing in his life. Desperate, he rushed to the Velastar bar, convinced that the bartender there would recognize him, since just a few hours ago he had purchased the most expensive bottle of wine. To his disbelief, the bottle was still sealed and displayed on the shelf. The bartender nearly mistook Jackson for a lunatic and kicked him out. Jackson grew even more confused. Was his memory truly failing him? While waiting for the results, Jackson noticed the mark left by a ring on his finger. Once again, he was certain that his memories of Daniela Daniela were real. However, the doctor reported something strange. His brain showed no signs of injury. Instead, they had detected a neuroactive compound in his blood. Jackson recalled the drug injected into him by the masked man, but couldn't figure out how to explain it. The doctor then began verifying his personal details. According to the records, the Jackson of this world was a leading scientist and physicist who had won the prestigious Bavia Award at a very young age. However, since receiving the award, he had been missing for over a year. Borrowing an iPad, Jackson quickly closed the news article. He started searching for information about his wife, Daniela. To his astonishment, she turned out to be a public figure in this world. Feeling increasingly anxious, Jackson put on a white lab coat and prepared to sneak out of the hospital. As he reached the entrance, he saw a woman rushing by. He immediately recognized her as one of the security personnel from the laboratory and quickly turned away to avoid her. After much difficulty, he finally managed to leave the hospital. The first place Jackson went to was an art exhibition. He had searched online and found out that his wife, Daniela, was hosting a painting exhibition there. Her achievements in the art world were highly regarded, and countless famous figures had come to support her event. In Jackson's memory, Daniela indeed loved painting, but shortly after their marriage, she had given up this passion. He didn't have time to ponder why, because on the wall hung a painting by Daniela, with him as the subject. A sudden wave of emotion surged in Jackson's heart, especially when he saw Daniela in person. Jackson almost burst into tears, but moments later, he felt as if he'd been struck by lightning. Even their son, Charlie, didn't recognize him. Daniela's attitude toward Jackson was casual and distant, treating him as nothing more than a friend. At that moment, Ryan also arrived. However, he was no longer the celebrated Bavia Award winner, but had become an ordinary university lecturer. Jackson's mind was in complete turmoil. After struggling through the rest of the exhibition, the three former university classmates, Jackson, Daniela, and Ryan, sat down together. Daniela and Ryan were deeply curious about where Jackson had been during the past year of his disappearance. It was a question Jackson couldn't answer. Instead, he described his life as he remembered it. Ryan becoming a successful and famous scientist, and Jackson marrying Daniela and having a child together. Everything had been normal until the day he encountered the masked man, after which everything changed. Daniela quickly corrected him, saying, "We are just close friends, nothing more." The only thing she didn't understand was that one day, a year ago, Jackson had suddenly come to see her and said some very strange things. According to her, Jackson had said, "Our existence is shaped by our choices. Different choices create different worlds. Theoretically, everyone exists in countless parallel worlds simultaneously, and the worst choice I ever made was the one involving you." Hearing this sent chills down Jackson's spine. Daniela spoke with such certainty that it was impossible for her to be lying. Yet Jackson had absolutely no memory of ever saying such things. At this point, Ryan couldn't stay silent any longer. Ryan believed that if this wasn't some cruel prank by Jackson, then something must be seriously wrong with Jackson's mind. Frustrated, he stormed out of the room, effectively ending the discussion. Meanwhile, Jackson formed a daring hypothesis. He called Amanda, who was currently living in his house, and invited her out, creating an opportunity to bring Daniela into the home. This was the house where, in his memory, he and Daniela had lived together for many years. However, the decor on the walls, which Jackson remembered vividly, had completely changed. The two went upstairs to the study. While searching through documents, Jackson spoke about their son, Charlie, mentioning how much he resembled Daniela and how he also had an extraordinary talent for painting. Daniela wiped her eyes and finally revealed something from the past. Long ago, she and Jackson had been in love. When she accidentally became pregnant, Jackson had used his busy schedule in scientific research as an excuse to avoid building a family and ultimately broke up with her. Jackson adamantly denied this. He insisted that when he learned Daniela was pregnant, he didn't hesitate to leave the lab and marry her. Daniela stood frozen in place, utterly stunned and unable to utter a word. After that, Daniela went downstairs. Jackson hurriedly gathered the documents on the desk and followed her to her car. Daniela admitted that she believed what Jackson was saying, but she couldn't understand why their shared experiences had two entirely different versions. This was exactly what Jackson was determined to uncover. In the study, he discovered the truth hidden in a notebook. The Jackson of this world had invented a massive iron box, equipped with a quantum system capable of enabling interdimensional travel, allowing people to traverse between parallel worlds. Back then, when Daniela became pregnant, the two versions of Jackson had made entirely different choices. One chose to continue his scientific research, while the other chose to return to his family. This divergence split the two Jacksons into separate universes. However, the Jackson from this world wasn't content with his decision. Driven by regret, he created the enormous quantum box to cross into another parallel universe and swap lives with the current Jackson. This revelation answered all the mysteries. Although it sounded unbelievable, Daniela trusted Jackson unconditionally. Jackson then shared with her the details of their marriage. As he remembered it, the two of them became increasingly excited as they prepared to embrace each other passionately. Just as they were about to kiss, the doorbell suddenly rang. Jackson felt an unsettling premonition. Peering through the peephole, he saw that it was the laboratory security. They immediately entered and locked the door. Daniela was about to call the police when, to their shock, the security security guard opened fire and killed her. Jackson tragically was captured and taken back to the laboratory. The head of this research project was Leighton, who appeared deeply distressed. He never imagined things would escalate to this point. Before, he and Jackson had been close, even calling each other by familiar names. Jackson's colleague, Amanda, was equally troubled. She couldn't understand why the key figure of their project had taken such an opposing stance. At this moment, a police officer arrived at the laboratory. Leighton, unable to avoid the situation, had to step forward to handle things. The officer was there because of Jackson. Having been missing for over a year, Jackson had been added to the police's missing persons list. A few days earlier, Jackson had suddenly reappeared at a hospital, attended the art exhibition, and now had disappeared once again. Detective Mason was eager to find out whether Jackson's boss, Leighton, was aware of this news. Leighton feigned surprise and asked Jackson why he hadn't contacted him, his acting no different from that of an Oscar-winning actor. Detective Mason, speaking with hidden meaning, pointed out that Leighton's Vero City laboratory had had 3 staff members go missing. She would certainly investigate the matter thoroughly. After a tense back and forth, they finally managed to send the police away. Leighton was furious. Just then, Amanda arrived to confront him, criticizing his newly hired female security guard for being too impulsive. Daniela had only just picked up the phone to call the police when the guard had immediately shot and killed her. While the body had been disposed of thoroughly, Amanda questioned whether this wouldn't bring trouble to Jackson. However, Leighton believed that his security guard had acted correctly. Jackson could not avoid the police's attention, as they suspected the laboratory was behind the disappearances. It was crucial to note that Leighton had invested billions into the project. If things went wrong, not only would the money be wasted, but he could also end up behind bars. Amanda, after much consideration, finally regained some of her composure and rationality. She said that the most important thing now was for the technical director to help Jackson recover his memory, because their project couldn't proceed without him. Coincidentally, it seemed that Jackson had begun to regain his thoughts. "I want to recover my memory," he said, and this was the result both sides had been hoping for. Leighton secretly felt relieved. Finally, his investment had a chance to be salvaged. Jackson, however, had his own plans. By agreeing to take this step, not only would he learn the principles of time travel, but he would also uncover what exactly the laboratory was doing. A famous saying goes, "If someone can kill, they will," indicating that their scheme was not small at all. Leighton, unaware of Jackson's true intentions, personally escorted him to the central area of the laboratory. In the middle of the room stood a large metal box. Jackson had previously come across documents related to this box. From his journal and his time in university, he had created a similar model, so he quickly figured out its principle. This box was a tool to create a superposition state. Due to too many external factors affecting it, the project had only remained in the theoretical stage. After hearing this, Leighton immediately confirmed that Jackson's memory had stopped before he received the Pavia Award. This was because, later on, he had invented a type of intelligent material that not only could block all external sounds and radiation, but also generate a powerful magnetic field on its own. Jackson couldn't deny that this invention was incredibly brilliant. Eagerly, he pushed open the metal box, but Amanda reminded him that he was the only one who had entered and could still exit. Previously, 3 laboratory employees had conducted this experiment, but none of them were able to leave. Since they couldn't install communication devices inside the box, they couldn't know what had happened. Jackson reviewed the footage from the cameras before his disappearance. He saw himself in this world casually walking into the metal box. As soon as the door was closed, Amanda hurried to the scene, but unfortunately, it was too late. When the door of the metal box was opened again, there was no one inside anymore. 3 days ago, Jackson suddenly crawled out of the box. He clearly remembered everything that happened after he woke up in the laboratory. He also understood why Leighton and the other colleagues were so agitated. To understand the technique of time travel, Jackson had gone through many records about the experiments, including the personal history of Jackson from this world. At this point, Amanda was in a much better mood. She asked Jackson if he truly couldn't remember that they had lived together and that they had once been in a relationship. However, Jackson no longer had any emotional attachment to her. Amanda didn't mind starting over, and she also revealed that she was the laboratory's psychologist, specializing in adjusting the emotions of the lab staff. She added that not everyone could remain calm in the face of such sudden changes, especially with the experiment's disappearance. During their conversation, Amanda also mentioned Jackson's close friend Ryan, who was responsible for providing a special drug for the laboratory. However, only Jackson knew the exact effects of this drug. Jackson sighed, realizing that he was no longer the person he once was, but rather a version of himself in the eyes of others. Although this statement was difficult to understand, Amanda quickly grasped its meaning. Was Jackson no longer the person he used to be, or had he come from another parallel world, where his past self had been so focused on research that he missed out on the love of his life? Now, having crossed into this world, he finally had the chance to start over. Jackson wanted to do his best to play the role of a husband and father, but replacing his former self without anyone noticing a flaw was incredibly difficult. At least, he didn't even know the names of his closest family and friends. What worried him more was that his wife mentioned they would host a party at their house tomorrow night, plans they had made made a long time ago. Jackson pretended to suddenly remember. Jackson had achieved great accomplishments, so naturally, he wasn't going to be easily troubled by this situation. He specifically took his son to the skateboard shop that he loved, trying to gather information about the people who would attend the party that evening. The boy, completely absorbed in his favorite skateboard, didn't pay any attention to why his father was asking so many silly questions. At the party the following day at their house, Jackson not only remembered everyone's names, but also made them laugh wholeheartedly. Ran, one of his few close friends, didn't notice anything different about him and even felt that Jackson seemed to be in better spirits than before. In the evening, during dinner, Daniela asked Jackson the name of the hotel they had stayed at last Thanksgiving for a vacation. He had been very fond of that hotel. Jackson stood there for a moment, then suddenly remembered the picture of the hotel on his phone. With a stroke of luck, he was able to say the name of the hotel. Jackson in his previous world had mostly interacted with famous people. Now, dealing with ordinary people like this was as easy as flipping a switch. Daniela was very pleased with her husband's performance that evening, though she noticed that lately he had been more clingy. Jackson had already figured out the reason. He said that the night they went to Ryan's celebration party, he had been in a car accident. During that time, many thoughts had crossed his mind, and he finally understood his own heart. In fact, the only thing he truly cared about was Daniela. The truth proved that no woman could resist sweet words. Meanwhile, Jackson was living a fulfilling life, but the Jackson from this parallel world, who originally had a happy family, now had to face a new danger. Ratson had Jackson's close friend, Ryan, come over to confirm again that Jackson was no longer the same person he used to be, because he had previously told Ryan about this. Jackson tried to resist, but was beaten by bodyguards, leaving his face bruised. Now, Layton no longer had to worry. He wanted to know how to find the original Jackson again, or how to use the metal box, because the original Jackson had once said that the magical metal box could bring about an entirely new world. Layton believed it and invested a large sum of money. However, the person he was after suddenly disappeared, which made Layton furious. In fact, Jackson was even more anxious than Layton. He too wanted to understand how to use the metal box, because, no matter what, he had to return to his original world to reunite with his wife and child. The bodyguards, under Layton's orders, locked Jackson and Ryan in the same room. During their conversation, Ryan mentioned the unique characteristics of the drug provided to the laboratory. It could put a part of the brain into a dormant state for a short period. However, no one knew exactly what the drug was used for. Jackson immediately thought of the principle behind the metal box. It could place a person into a state of overlapping realities, but theoretically, this couldn't happen because human consciousness wouldn't allow it. This was the observer effect we often talk about. But once the brain responsible for this function fell into a dormant state, the overlapping reality state was perfectly activated. Additionally, the key to starting the metal box was the drug provided by Ryan. The two had not yet finalized their plan when Layton suddenly barged in with bodyguards. He had something important to discuss with Ryan. Jackson, left alone in the room, was about to lie down when Amanda suddenly rushed in. She turned off all the cameras and planned to take Jackson out of there. Amanda deeply regretted revealing her suspicions to Legend. Regardless of whether Jackson was still the same person she had known before, she felt she had to help him. However, as they were heading out to the lobby, they ran into Layton, the person in charge. Seeing all the bodyguards in action, there was no way to escape. They had no choice but to hide in the metal box and deal with things later. However, the door would only stay closed for 3 minutes before it would automatically open again. Coincidentally, there was a box of the drug provided by Ryan in the corner. Amanda suggested they activate the overlapping state to escape, and Jackson, with no time to think, injected the drug into his body. In a dazed state, Jackson saw Amanda inject herself with the drug as well. After 3 minutes, both of them regained consciousness, but the scene around them had completely changed. They were surrounded by 2 rows of iron doors that seemed endless, with no visible end. Jackson guessed that this was a transfer station that took them to different parallel worlds. Each door led to a different world. Unfortunately, the iron doors all looked identical, and they wondered how they could return to Jackson's original world. Afterward, they opened one of the iron doors, only to find themselves back inside the enormous metal box. They nervously stepped out and found themselves in what appeared to be a laboratory, but it had been abandoned for a long time. Jackson was extremely curious about what had happened in this world. As they moved out of the lab, they were shocked by the sight before them. Large dust particles, as big as goose feathers, floated through the air. The murky sea slapped against the shore, and the entire world seemed bathed in a deathly yellow hue. As they stood in bewilderment, the tall building nearby began to shake. Right after that, everything around them collapsed like a series of dominoes. Luckily, the two of them managed to run quickly and hide inside the metal box. Jackson then used a satellite locator and discovered that their current position was exactly the same as the position of the metal box in their original world. This confirmed that the location of the box had not changed, only the world outside had shifted. As they talked, they injected themselves with the drug again, and once more, they found themselves back in the interdimensional hallway. Jackson didn't give up. He opened another metal door, only to find the outside world transformed into a dry forest. He didn't dare explore further and returned to the interdimensional path. This time, Jackson decided not to take the special drug, possibly because its effects had worn off. The two of them opened yet another door, and this time, they saw a world being scorched by an intense sun. Amanda was puzzled and wondered if there was an end to this path. Jackson immediately called her back. He explained that the number of possible worlds was infinite, as every decision created countless possibilities. Perhaps behind one of those doors was a version of themselves stuck in the laboratory, unable to escape. Now, they had to urgently search for food and water so they could open more metal doors and eventually find a world familiar to them. Jackson continued to open the doors, and this time, the scene outside the metal box was identical to the layout of the laboratory. As they were surprised, they saw the person in charge, Legend, in the distance, leading his guards who were chasing Amanda and Jackson. In this alternate version of the world, the two sides could not agree. The female bodyguard, Dawn, shot and killed Amanda. Terrified, Jackson and his group quickly ran back into the metal box. Amanda immediately realized that this world was another version where they could never escape the laboratory. Without hesitation, Jackson opened the next metal door, but each world they encountered was in an extremely extreme state. Jackson was curious how his scientific research-obsessed version had managed to pinpoint the target world. But after several repeated failures, Amanda couldn't take it anymore. She was on the verge of despair when they stumbled into a world covered in snow. Jackson rushed out, but the snowstorm was so fierce that when their footprints vanished, they were unable to find the way back. Soon after, Amanda became so cold that she fainted, and Jackson had no choice but to carry her forward. Fortunately, they came across a house along the way. Without hesitation, he brought Amanda inside. Although there was no snowstorm inside, Amanda's condition didn't improve until the fire in the stove started to blaze. Once the warmth settled in, Amanda's breathing began to stabilize. The next morning, it seemed like the snow outside was about to bury the house. Jackson stepped outside and looked into the distance. This was a world immersed in snow, and the path leading to the space-time portal had almost disappeared. Jackson cursed the person who caused this countless times. As the creator of the scientific project that allowed people to travel through worlds, Jackson had completely adapted to this life. He no longer worked relentlessly in the lab, but instead focused on living and enjoying the gentleness of his loved ones. That day was Charlie's 16th birthday. Jackson asked how he felt, and Charlie replied that every birthday felt the same, with the only difference being that after today, he would be able to take his driving test and no longer had to drive secretly. The next day, Jackson went to class and found that none of the students were paying attention to his lecture. Angrily, he threw a glass bottle in his hand, successfully grabbing their attention. However, Jackson soon realized that many students had come to class without bringing paper or pens. All they had were laptops playing videos. Without hesitation, he turned around and left. The expert Jackson from before had always worked on top-tier projects, and he thought that teaching a group of lazy students here was a waste of his time. He met with the principal and resigned. Afterward, he went to a luxurious villa, the residence of the laboratory head, Vero City Layton. In this world, Layton was still just a young, spoiled heir. His grandfather, his closest family member, had passed away not long ago, and Layton had completely lost his sense of purpose in life. Jackson wasn't just a collaborator with Layton for many years, like in the old world. They were also college classmates. When Jackson told him his goal for coming here, he wanted Layton to invest in his research project. Until then, Jackson took Layton to an abandoned construction site, where he did not mention what research project he was working on. Instead, he told Layton to drink a special vial of medicine. At the same time, Jackson, in the snow-covered world, finally managed to wake Amanda up. After learning that the metal box had been buried by snow and ice, she felt deeply regretful for her impulsive actions the previous night. Now, having to survive in such harsh conditions, she couldn't help but recall the time several years ago when she went skiing with her father and encountered a snowstorm. Jackson immediately noticed something and asked Amanda if, the night before in the interdimensional corridor, she had thought the same thing. Amanda nodded. The interdimensional corridor, though invisible to the naked eye, felt endless, like being trapped in a snowstorm, suffocating. Jackson quickly understood. The doors they opened, though they seemed to lead to unknown worlds, were likely the result of their own thinking. The worlds they saw were reflections of their true state when they opened the doors. The previous night, Amanda had thought of a snowstorm, which is why she opened the world filled with snow. Jackson thought about an alternate version of themselves, where they couldn't escape the laboratory. When they opened the door, they coincidentally saw that scene. Perhaps this was the correct way to control the metal box. The more he thought about it, the more excited he became. He had finally found a way to return home. Meanwhile, in this version, Jackson, the scientist, had taken Layton to the metal box. When they entered, the surroundings had transformed into a long corridor. Layton's eyes widened in shock, but the most surprising things still lay ahead. Jackson said he wanted to give Layton a taste of an ideal world, but the most important thing was to clear the distractions from his mind. Jackson knew exactly what Layton wanted. As long as Layton followed him, that was enough. Back in the snow-covered world, Jackson had led Amanda out of the cabin, determined to find their way back to the original world. They had to locate the metal box buried in the snow. The satellite positioning system had malfunctioned due to the harsh weather, but Amanda Amanda came up with another idea. The position of the metal box was fixed, and it had a strong magnetic field. The two of them followed the compass directions, hoping it would lead them to the right place. Eventually, they found the location of the metal box beneath the thick snow. After injecting the special drug, they successfully entered the interdimensional corridor. The way home was right in front of them, but Jackson wasn't in a hurry. He looked at his watch with a hint of sadness and said that today was his son Charlie's birthday. Meanwhile, in the laboratory world, the scientist Jackson had led Legend, who was wide-eyed with astonishment, out of the metal box. Nathan encountered his deceased grandfather in this parallel world. Jackson proudly claimed that he could bring anyone to their ideal world. Nathan immediately recognized the economic value in this plan and was willing to give up everything to invest in it. Meanwhile, the scientist Jackson, reflecting on his life, sighed and realized that he was born to be a researcher. What he didn't know was that his beautiful wife was at home, heartbroken. Not only was it their son Charlie's birthday, but it was also the anniversary of another child they had lost. For the past 16 years, Jackson had never missed a birthday, but only today, he left early in the morning and hadn't returned yet. Danella still didn't know that her real husband was in the interdimensional tunnel, using a different way to remember their lost son. Jackson told Amanda that when his wife Daniela was pregnant, the doctor informed them that their unborn child had a heart condition. Despite the diagnosis, the couple insisted on keeping the baby. After multiple surgeries, unfortunately, they couldn't save the child. The pain of losing their son still haunted Jackson to this day. The scientist Jackson, however, couldn't remain confined to the laboratory. Why did he run to change his life? Amanda remarked that the scientist Jackson was a determined person whose decisions were always carefully calculated. Jackson was surprised, thinking he was just a poor, ordinary teacher, not worthy of the scientist Jackson's effort. Amanda seemed to be thinking about something when Jackson suddenly realized. Could it be that the scientist Jackson was after his wife and child? At that moment, Daniel and Charlie were feeling down from Jackson's absence when the door suddenly opened and the scientist Jackson walked in. He explained that he was late because he had been preparing something for Charlie. After Jackson opened a small box, Charlie, who had been feeling down, was filled with joy upon discovering a car key inside. He nearly jumped with excitement, as his biggest dream was to own a car once he got his driver's license. Daniela, who was standing behind, was also surprised because their family's financial situation didn't allow for the purchase of a new car. Jackson explained everything, telling them that he felt his achievements shouldn't stop here. So, he had resigned from his teaching job and used his college invention to attract a large investment. He also encouraged Daniela to return to her passion for painting, to pursue her dream of becoming an artist. Jackson had learned how to use the interdimensional tunnel. Turns out, it was all about one's mental state. Before opening the door, the state of mind would decide the shape of the parallel world. This time, Jackson held his breath and focused, thinking that he absolutely had to return home. But as soon as he opened the door, a massive wave of seawater surged in. The parallel world they had entered was being attacked by a tsunami. Amanda and Jackson struggled until the metal box sank into the water-filled space. Together, they managed to close the iron door, and after much effort, they finally returned to the interdimensional corridor. Jackson was panting, wondering if the method they had thought of was wrong. Amanda guessed that the pressure on Jackson had caused the door to the parallel world to veer off course. She suggested he rest for the night, regain his emotional balance, and then try again. True to her role as a psychologist, Amanda always knew how to find the right topic to lighten the mood. As they talked, she wondered about the other people who had previously participated in the metal box experiment, especially her close friend, Belle. The two of them drifted off to sleep. In the middle of the night, Jackson and Amanda woke up, both hungry since they hadn't eaten anything all day. They knew they needed to find a place with food. When they opened the iron door, they found themselves in the familiar Vero City laboratory. However, to their surprise, there was no one around, and even the elevator was out of service. Amanda said that the laboratory only entered lockdown mode when something went wrong, so she was unsure what had happened here. The two of them wandered into a break room, where it appeared someone was lying on the bed. When they opened the blanket, they were shocked to find a dried-up corpse. Jackson had a bad feeling, and just as they were about to return to the metal box, the hallway suddenly lit up. In such a situation, encountering a living person was far from reassuring. As the figure approached, Amanda was stunned to see it was her long-lost friend. Belle, who had voluntarily participated in the experiment, had disappeared after the metal box incident, but now they found her in this parallel world. After they ate and were properly nourished, Belle began recounting her experiences. At first, she had gone through various parallel worlds just like Amanda, but then she discovered that in this world, she was in a different version, where she had brought a mutated insect species back, which had destroyed everything. The insect species had an extremely strong reproductive capacity, and with no natural predators, it quickly spread across the world. Amanda was curious, asked why Belle stayed in this world despite the chaos caused by the insects. Belle, feeling down, explained that the special drug she had with her was running out, and the drugs from the laboratory had all been taken by the staff. But that wasn't the main reason for her sorrow. Belle had gone through through countless parallel worlds, but most versions of herself had their own lives and families, which made her feel incredibly lonely. She felt as though the entire world rejected her. Blay preferred staying in her small room in this apocalyptic world, rather than venturing into another world. Amanda felt deeply guilty, realizing that she shouldn't have invited Blay to join the experiment in the first place. She wanted to persuade Blay to come back with her, but Blay firmly refused. She even warned Amanda that if she continued following Jackson, she might not find the life she truly desired. Before parting, Blay gave Amanda a journal where she had recorded her reflections from her many journeys through parallel worlds. In the journal, Blay emphasized that to enter the ideal world one truly wants, it's not just about focusing. The fear of losing focus or underlying fears can also influence the direction of the new world. As Amanda returned to the space corridor, she felt overwhelmed with sadness. Amanda, feeling a growing resentment towards Jackson, believed that Blay's life had been ruined by the box, the very experiment that was supposed to explore alternate realities. She began to hate the scientist version of Jackson, realizing that he could have returned to the original world and stopped others from entering the experiment, but he chose not to. On the other hand, the version of Jackson who had settled into family life empathized with the scientist Jackson's mindset. Initially, when his girlfriend Daniela was pregnant, he had struggled with the decision, eventually choosing family over the lab. He worked hard to fulfill his role as a husband and father, hoping to prove that his choice was the right one. But the scientist Jackson, who chose the lab, later realized that this decision didn't bring as many rewards as he had hoped, prompting him to decisively sever ties with his past life. After this reflection, Jackson came up with a highly effective method to control the box. He realized that writing something down is when a person is most focused. Amanda immediately understood. Rather than using their minds to imagine the world they wanted, they should write it down. This simple, yet profound realization opened up a new path for them to navigate the space corridor. Jackson was overwhelmed with joy when he opened the door and saw the familiar scene in front of him. This was the place where the scientist Jackson had previously abducted him, and all the events that had transpired here were still fresh in his memory. Jackson was so moved that he teared up, certain that this was his world. However, after they stepped out of the abandoned construction site, they realized there were no AI to be seen anywhere. Amanda quickly deduced that this world was another version of an apocalyptic reality. She suggested they return to the box immediately, but Jackson was reluctant. After all, this was the first world similar to his own that he had encountered. He insisted on going home to see what had happened. They found an abandoned car in front of a shopping mall, but once again, there were no AI to be found. This deepened Jackson's anxiety. When they knocked on the door of the house, they were met with the sound of footsteps, and Daniel, looking pale and weary, slowly opened the door. She was shocked to see him, as she thought her husband had already been taken away. Jackson, bewildered, entered the house and soon realized that this world was being ravaged by a new virus. At that moment, several soldiers wearing protective gear passed by on the street. After confirming that Jackson wasn't infected, they advised him to go home quickly, but Jackson said his wife and child had been infected. The medical staff told him that the hospital was overcrowded and then handed him several vials of medication to ensure the patients could pass away peacefully. Amanda advised him to leave, fearing he might get infected, but Jackson was determined. No matter what, the woman in front of him was still his wife, Daniela. He looked at the family photo on the wall, recalling past memories, and Daniela's emotions gradually stabilized. He then took the medication and gave her a humane death. When he returned to the box, Jackson felt deeply sad. The woman who had just passed away looked exactly like Daniela, with the same appearance and memories. The only difference was the final outcome. Amanda began to summarize the process of the time travel. This time, Jackson wrote on the paper, "I want to meet my family," but when he opened the door, he still carried the sadness with him. This was because Jackson's mother had died of illness, and deep in his subconscious, he feared that his family might also suffer from illness. After hearing this, Jackson seemed to understand something. When he opened the next steel door, finally, they arrived at a normal world where the surroundings were exactly like the images from Jackson's memories. Once again, Jackson became excited. Could it be that he had finally succeeded? When he reached his familiar home, he found that the scientific version of Jackson was arguing with his wife, Daniela. She was angry because her husband had made all the decisions on his own. Not only had he been absent on their son's birthday yesterday, but he had also resigned from his job and bought their son a new car. She was disappointed that she hadn't been involved in these decisions. At this moment, the family man version of Jackson entered the living room of his home to confront the scientific Jackson. He took a knife from the kitchen and sneaked upstairs into the bedroom. However, he saw a different version of Neoga, who was extremely agitated, shouting at Jackson to leave. Neoga even called the police. Just then, Jackson's son Charlie rushed in from behind, and together with his mother, they forced Jackson out. Seeing the police car racing toward them, Jackson said to Amanda, "The Jackson in this world is divorced from Daniela and is even wanted by the police." Now, Jackson couldn't openly return to the box. He suggested that Amanda find a familiar place to stay for the night. Amanda immediately thought of one person, her mother, mother. However, when her mother saw her, she was so shocked that she kept stepping back. It turned out that Amanda in this world had already died. But soon, her mother's fear faded and she started gently caressing the daughter in front of her. Amanda pretended to stay calm and told her mother that her current life was going well and that she shouldn't miss her too much. After saying that, Amanda took Jackson and left, grabbing the car keys from the table as they left. After traveling through this world, the two began to understand Claire's thoughts. Indeed, each character in the parallel worlds had their own life. Suddenly intruding into someone else's world only brought them much trouble. But sometimes, there are exceptions. The scientific version of Jackson had spent many years planning and finally replaced Jackson's life, living a perfect life for the family. After comforting his wife, he thought that he should still focus on developing his own career to reassure the investor. Leighton, he decided to train Legend on how to enter the world he desired. The reasoning was quite similar to Jackson's experience of living for his family, but completely controlling one's thoughts and subconscious is not something AI can easily do. Jackson reminded Leighton that the most common mistake for beginners was to enter a parallel world that had just been separated. Under Jackson's guidance, Leighton eventually reached the world he desired, but human desires are endless. He still wanted to see other ideal worlds. Jackson said that wasn't possible. The effect of the drug would last only 5 more minutes, and its supply was limited. Leighton couldn't understand. Wasn't it just a few vials of medicine? He wanted to buy it back for $1,000 per vial. Indeed, money can make people lose sight of things. Dr. Jackson immediately returned to the original world. He wanted to gather enough of the special medicine. The assistant, who had seen Jackson rush in, quickly explained everything that had happened. Over the past period, not only had Amanda entered, but another version of Jackson had also entered the box, and even their boss, Leighton, had done so. Jackson felt a sense of fear after hearing this. Once he decided to return, he immediately made up his mind. He would seal this world off, ensuring that the version of himself as a family man could never come back. He would be able to live here with Daniela for the rest of his life. The protagonists of both worlds were, in fact, somewhat extreme. Whether choosing career or family, they both tried their best to excel, but they were still filled with regret or doubt about their decisions. Indeed, human desires are limitless. The man kept moving through parallel worlds, but he could never return to his original world. AI could understand the despair in his heart. Jackson furiously wrote down every detail of his memories, hoping that it might lead him back to his original world. But every time he opened the door, he felt deep disappointment. It wasn't because the color of the door was wrong. It was because his beloved wife was already with another man. Although he was so close to his original world, Jackson believed that these things didn't belong to his world. Psychologist Amanda suggested that Jackson take some rest, and one day, the two of them went to a high-end restaurant to enjoy a meal and relax. The frustration and worry in his heart gradually dissipated. Amanda revealed that in this world, she wasn't a psychologist but a manager of a restaurant. Jackson couldn't understand how two versions of Amanda, who came from the same background, could have such different lives. This was something Amanda understood best. While a person's character is shaped by the age of 3, those are only instinctive responses to certain environments. Different choices lead to different life circumstances, and as a result, a person's personality can change. For example, it was very difficult for the scientist version of Jackson to control his emotions, but Jackson, in front of Amanda, was more empathetic and better at managing his emotions. Jackson believed this was due to the kind, gentle nature of his wife. He could only use temporary joy to forget the sorrow deep inside him. After returning to the hotel, the two of them lay on the same bed. Jackson felt that today was the most comfortable day he had had in recent times. However, it seemed like his world was drifting further away. Amanda knew Jackson was still thinking about his wife, so she proactively went to another room. At this moment, Jackson didn't know that it was very likely he would never be able to return to his original world. This was because the scientist version of Jackson had decided to seal the mouth of the box of this world. He was preparing to give the investor Latan a box full of special crossing pills, hoping the investor could find the perfect world in his heart. The two of them happily waved goodbye. After receiving a large sum of money, Jackson advised his wife to become a professional artist. Before, Daniela had been worried about the family's financial situation, but now that her husband had secured a large investment, she was truly moved by the idea. As evening approached, Jackson took his son out to play. When he noticed Charlie seemed a little tired, Jackson gave him a jar of ice cream he had bought earlier. However, after eating a few bites, Charlie suddenly began to convulse. Although the medication was administered in time, Charlie still had to stay in the hospital for a few days for observation. Daniela rushed to the hospital, questioning whether something was wrong with Jackson's mind. Their son had been allergic to nuts since he was little, and yet Jackson had given him nut-flavored ice cream. The very thing Jackson had feared the most had happened. Although he and the other Jackson in this world looked exactly alike, they were still different in many ways. Despite sharing the same appearance, he couldn't possibly know all the little details from the past 15 years in such a short time. What worried Jackson even more was that Daniela was a very meticulous woman. She remembered that Jackson never had a habit of using dental floss. Jackson could only explain that he had recently started paying more attention to his his dental health. The more Daniela thought about it, the more she felt something was wrong. So, she went to talk to her best friend for some advice. Daniela felt that Jackson had changed too much lately, not only in small daily habits, but also in his clothing, mannerisms, and even his plans for the future. What made Daniela even more uneasy was something that had happened the previous night at the hospital. She noticed injection marks on Jackson's arm, and he frequently ran out of the house in the middle of the night. Daniela wanted to find the right time to confront her husband, but she gave herself a piece of advice first: she shouldn't jump to conclusions. She needed to investigate the truth. It wasn't just her, though. At this moment, Jackson also felt that his wife no longer trusted him. He proactively sought out psychologist Amanda. Since there was no Verocity laboratory in this world, Amanda had opened a psychological clinic. After hearing Jackson's story, Amanda immediately addressed the issue, suggesting that Jackson was a man who pursued perfection and in reality wasn't satisfied with his wife. However, Jackson stubbornly refused to admit it. He decided to organize a romantic date to strengthen the bond between him and his wife. Amanda reminded him that sometimes what he thought was romantic might not be the kind of romance the other person wanted. But Jackson didn't think so. When he returned home, he prepared a beautiful dress and then blindfolded Daniela to take her to an exhibition. Navigating through the crowded streets, Donalda was taken aback when she saw a painting of herself on the wall in the most prominent spot. Her expression immediately changed. Jackson hadn't expected the surprise he had meticulously prepared to turn into fear. Daniela felt embarrassed because the painting was something she had created when she was bored at home, with no artistic value at all. Even the dress she was wearing wasn't to her liking. She didn't want her husband to make decisions for her. Jackson was puzzled as well, wondering if this stemmed from the fact that they hadn't spent enough time understanding each other. Instead of going home with his wife, he drove off alone. Daniela recalled the advice from her best friend and secretly followed him. She saw Jackson enter a storage room, stay for a moment, and then hurry out again. Daniela was very curious about what might be inside. Unfortunately, the door was locked. She had no choice but to peep through the crack to investigate. She used a metal rod to pull out a used vial of medicine. Connecting it with the injection marks on Jackson's arm, she hurried to meet her friend Ryan. The other party had significant achievements in the field of biological research. Daniela asked him to analyze the remaining contents of the medicine vial. After thinking for a moment, Ryan agreed. Meanwhile, Jackson was in the corridor, continuing his time travel, now accompanied by Amanda, as they entered another parallel world. It seemed like Amanda had grown tired of the endless time traveling, so she suggested they separate and each experience a new world on their own, planning to meet up again the next morning. The next morning, Jackson went to the place where his wife worked. Although Daniela was right in front of him, her hairstyle clearly indicated that she wasn't his wife. Jackson, unsure of why, felt a strong urge to speak with her. He suggested they have coffee together after work, but to his surprise, Daniela hesitated for a second and then firmly declined. At that moment, Amanda was observing her own life in a different version, where she appeared to have a happy family life. When she returned to the box, Jackson had already been waiting for her for a while. From his demeanor, she could tell that his day had been tough as well. The two of them decided to find a hotel to stay in. Jackson said that he had been following Daniela for an entire day. In another version of the world, she had shared a meal and watched a movie with Jackson, and finally, he understood Jackson's feelings of secretly observing his own life. The fighting spirit within Jackson grew even stronger. He was determined to find his own world. Amanda shook her head, saying that the world Jackson sought was like a grain of sand on a beach. Jackson had already experienced many worlds. He had seen his wife be murdered, watched her die from illness. His mind was on the verge of breaking from the weight of these memories. Now, there were only 10 vials of the special drug left. The number of chances to try was growing fewer. Seeing Jackson beginning to lose hope, Amanda quickly encouraged him, saying they couldn't give up, but they would need to change their approach. Meanwhile, the scientist Jackson was also consulting Amanda about his psychological state. His plan to create a romantic surprise had failed, leaving Jackson with a deep shock. He had fought so hard to get here, only to see everything unravel. He was even considering leaving. Jackson confessed to Amanda that he had many choices. His life after that seemed like countless doors on both sides of a hallway. He could open any door and choose a different life. Amanda thought this metaphor was interesting and pointed out that perhaps what Jackson felt most comfortable with wasn't a world beyond one of those doors, but simply staying in the hallway with its infinite choices. Upon hearing this, Jackson seemed to ponder something. When he got home, he unexpectedly ran into his college friend Ryan. Ryan pulled out the vial of the experimental drug, accusing Jackson of being a thief because the components of the drug were identical to the one Ryan was researching. Of course, Jackson couldn't explain that this drug came from Ryan in another world to facilitate time travel. He interrogated Ryan about where the vial came from. When Ryan refused to answer, Jackson switched tactics and asked about the drug's purpose. Ryan's face turned slightly pale as he revealed that the drug could only be used to induce anesthesia or a full-body sedative, as its effect was to hypnotize the brain. Jackson was extremely proud as he prepared to show Ryan how he would use the drug. He then took Ryan to an abandoned construction site. After injecting the drug, the space inside the steel box immediately transformed into the time-traveling corridor. Ryan quickly understood its principle. The space was created by a superimposition state. He couldn't believe his drug could be used this way. Jackson reminded Ryan that something even more miraculous awaited behind him. After confirming that Ryan had cleared all distractions from his mind, Jackson gently opened the nearby steel door. A brilliantly colorful scientific world unfolded before them. This was the perfect world Jackson had created for Ryan. Ryan was shocked by what he was seeing. Jackson asked to borrow Ryan's phone to take a commemorative photo, but secretly moved closer to the steel box door. Ryan immediately realized that the Jackson before him wasn't the same person he knew. However, he realized this too late. Without hesitation, Jackson closed the door to the box, leaving Ryan trapped in this world forever. Upon returning, Jackson immediately took Ryan's phone. At the moment Jackson saw a call from Daniela, he immediately suspected that the drug used in the experiment had been given to Ryan by his wife. He sensed a significant threat, so he quickly called the construction workers to pour concrete over the steel box door. This time, no one could destroy the life he had built. Amanda was right about Jackson. He was impulsive, stubborn, and had an extremely high need for control. Jackson pouring concrete over the door of the steel box was likely due to two reasons. One, he didn't want the Jackson who cared for his family to return, and two, it was a way to oppose Amanda's perspective, as she had told him that what he really wanted was the corridor with endless choices. By doing this, Jackson was essentially cutting off all his paths forward. However, I believe that this action would not stop Jackson from caring for his family and returning. Rather, it might create an opportunity for him to fulfill his desires. Amanda suggested thinking about it from a different perspective to find the original world. If Jackson didn't focus on the world he wanted to reach, but instead considered the world that the scientist version of Jackson would least want to enter, it would likely help him achieve his goal. As for the steel box being covered in concrete, there was no need to worry too much. It should be remembered that the steel box was opened from the inside, not pushed out from the outside. The presence of the concrete wall outside could actually prove that the AI didn't want the original Jackson to come to this world, and Jackson had many ways to break through that concrete wall. A girl opened the heavy steel door, and a world with lush green grass and a clear sky greeted them. The pathway was neat and tidy, with no signs of being marred by modern industrial development. Every house had greenery on its balcony. This was the environment where humans were meant to live. The pedestrians they met told them that this world had successfully implemented cold nuclear fusion, creating a source of eternal clean energy. Amanda shared her experience of crossing dimensions, noting that while in the corridor of space, she felt that Jackson had grown weary and needed to find a place to rest for a day. After advising Jackson to relax and clear his mind, Amanda, after thinking for a moment, opened the door. And thus, she found herself in this perfect world. When Amanda opened the door, she wasn't thinking about anything in particular, but was instead relying on her human instincts, desiring a modern, safe, and clean world. This approach gave Jackson a new insight. Amanda had done her best, drawing from the descriptions of things people wanted, rather than focusing on a specific object. The two went to a bar for a drink, and while there, they overheard staff mentioning that a nearby skyscraper was a famous tourist spot. Amanda quickly strapped on her backpack, saying she had some business to take care of. She arranged to meet Jackson in 2 hours at the skyscraper, and then left. As Jackson was making his way to the building, two men approached and asked him to take their photo. They also revealed a picture they had secretly taken earlier, where Jackson and Amanda were smiling together. 2 hours later, Jackson arrived at the skyscraper and took the elevator to the top floor. Looking down, the view made him feel as if he was standing on top of the clouds, with the sky right beneath him. Amanda had been waiting for him there, and she had prepared a suit for him. When Jackson emerged from the restroom, the messy man he had been earlier had transformed into a dapper gentleman. In the 2 hours that had passed, Amanda had gathered all the necessary information. Jackson in this world was an insurance salesman, and coincidentally, Amanda in this world had been missing for 2 years. She saw this as an incredibly rare opportunity and decided to settle in this world. In reality, both she and Jackson knew this, but neither of them said it aloud. Jackson had always been searching for his family, and once he succeeded, Amanda would be left alone. So, Amanda thought that perhaps she should give up now. At least she could stay in this perfect world and live on under her own identity. Jackson's eyes were filled with disappointment, but he knew this was the best choice for Amanda. However, to his surprise, she added one more thing. She hoped Jackson would stay in this world too. After thinking for a while, Jackson shook his head and refused. He took 2 vials of medicine from his pocket, reflecting on a day when Amanda might regret her decision and still have a chance to return to the world she once knew. Amanda firmly refused, stating that she had never regretted her actions. Jackson, helpless, stood up. As the two of them shared a passionate embrace, he secretly slipped the medicine into Amanda's bag. Afterward, Amanda silently left the restaurant, and as she stood alone in the elevator, her face was filled with sorrow and disappointment. It wasn't until the elevator passed through the clouds and sunlight streamed in that she tried to adjust her mood and begin a new life. Meanwhile, Jackson returned to the iron box, where only 3 vials of the special medicine medicine remained. Without hesitation, he started his journey home, but this time, he found himself in a desolate world, much like his current state of mind. He tried to clear his thoughts and used another vial of medicine, but sadly, this was not the world for him. Jackson called his wife, Daniela, knowing that he didn't have many chances left. Just hearing her voice was a small comfort, even though she didn't notice anything unusual. After quickly ending the call, Jackson felt a slight sense of relief. As he passed by a store, he noticed a familiar mask. It reminded him of when he was kidnapped by the scientist Jackson, who had worn the same mask. Suddenly, an idea struck Jackson's mind. Later, in the stillness of the night, he sneaked into his own home. In the bedroom, Jackson saw his wife and another version of himself sleeping soundly. His heart was filled with complex emotions. He wanted to follow the scientist Jackson's path, to kidnap this version of himself and take his place. But deep down, a voice stopped him. Suddenly, the kitchen light turned on, and Jackson thought it was Charlie, but it turned out to be his son, who had died from a heart disease. Jackson was shocked, and he wanted to embrace the child, but he soon realized that the boy wasn't happy. He always felt guilty about the stranger who had donated the heart to him. With a deep sigh, Jackson gave up on the idea of taking someone else's life. He then went to find his friend Ryan in this world. Originally, Jackson planned to ask Ryan for some of the special medicine so he could have more chances to try again. However, he discovered that Ryan was now just a regular mechanic. In college, Ryan had been arrested for drunk driving, and his life had completely changed. Now, only one vial of the special medicine remained, and Jackson was left uncertain about what to do next. Meanwhile, the scientist Jackson, in this world, was also living in torment. Before he used concrete to seal the door of the time travel box, he intended to do so to prevent further consequences. However, this only brought him greater trouble. First, his wife, Daniela, noticed something was wrong. 5 days ago, she asked Ryan to analyze the components of the medicine, and the result was that Ryan suddenly vanished, as if he had disappeared from time itself. Jackson did not reveal that he had left Ryan in another parallel world. It wasn't until Officer Mason personally came to his house that the situation escalated. Ryan's girlfriend had reported him missing after 3 full days, and Daniela couldn't hide the truth any longer. She admitted that the last time she saw Ryan was at their house 5 days ago. Jackson's response was that he had seen Ryan at a bar 3 days ago, where Ryan had drunk a lot and appeared to be troubled. Officer Mason smiled knowingly and said she would continue to investigate. When the police left, Daniela decided to confront her husband directly and ask what exactly was in the vial of medicine. Although Jackson had already known everything, when his wife admitted that she had been spying on him, Jackson suddenly flew into a rage. However, he still tried to patiently explain that it was a type of nerve medicine he used for his research project. He had kept it from Daniela only because he didn't want her to worry. Even though they had made up on the surface, Jackson, being a perfectionist, believed he had ruined everything. In his heart, Daniela was someone with a brilliant career and someone who was fully open to him. So, when facing the psychologist Amanda, Jackson openly confessed that he wanted to leave everything behind and escape this world. Jackson brought many worries home with him. Once again, he encountered Officer Mason, whose deep and inscrutable demeanor revealed that she had investigated Ryan's phone history. The last signal from it had been traced to an abandoned construction site on the outskirts. Mason asked Jackson if he hadn't been with Ryan at that time. When Jackson shook his head in denial, she prepared to extract camera footage for further investigation. Jackson's face darkened as he realized that the situation regarding Ryan's disappearance was about to unravel, and he wouldn't be able to hide the truth for much longer. So, he went back to the time travel box that had been sealed with concrete and began using a hammer to break it open again. Jackson didn't run away. Instead, he returned to the parallel world to bring back the dying Ryan, hoping that would prevent him from being charged with kidnapping by the police. Moreover, he genuinely couldn't bring himself to leave his wife, whom he had fought so hard to have. The man in the family, Jackson, in another world, had prepared himself for the worst-case scenario. He planned to use the last vial of the special drug. He remembered the methods Amanda had mentioned, not to focus on a specific object, but to recall every memory related to Daniela, from when they first met to when she gave birth to their child. Although he admired the Jackson of this world, who not only had Daniela, but also a child with heart disease who was still alive, he didn't want to use the method that had caused him so much suffering to steal the life of this version of Jackson. He had thought carefully about it. What he truly needed was his own life. He wanted to take the woman from this version of his world and set out again. Jackson opened the door, and a thick concrete hole appeared before him. He hadn't taken more than a few steps when he saw the vial of medicine on the ground. His hand trembled uncontrollably, and Jackson immediately ran to the Philip Tag bar. Sure enough, the bartender recognized him, and in his heart, Jackson was certain that this was the world he had been desperately searching for. He hurried home, and when he saw the familiar door, he truly wanted to cry. After a month of traveling through countless parallel worlds, enduring numerous moments of pain and disappointment, it felt as though he had bet everything he had. Finally, he was able to return to his own world. Jackson didn't make a scene. He simply stood from a distance, gazing at his wife and child, whom he had longed for. As he was about to go in to reunite with them, Jackson, the family man version of himself, himself, vaguely overheard a conversation inside the house. Ryan, who had been missing, had been found and was now resting at home. Jackson finally realized that before returning home, he had to resolve his greatest obstacle. He went to a store nearby, intending to buy a gun to chase away the unwanted guest in his house, but the store clerk refused because he didn't have a gun license. Jackson was left with no choice but to buy something else, a dagger and some pepper spray. He had just left the store when, not long after, another Jackson walked into the shop. This version of Jackson had also come to buy a gun, and the shop clerk was left stunned, asking, "Didn't you just come here?" It was then that Jackson realized another version of himself had been there earlier to purchase a gun. The clerk pointed out that the main difference between the two was that the other Jackson had a rope on his hand. Jackson quickly ran out of the store, but when he got outside, he couldn't find the other version of himself anywhere. Jackson, the family man version, had finally returned to his life, but that didn't mean he had succeeded. He not only had to face the ruthless scientist Jackson, but also the more despairing possibility that a completely new version of Jackson had emerged. Previously, when Jackson first traveled through worlds to remember the lost wedding ring, he had worn a rope on his finger. But this new version of Jackson, who had just appeared, not only didn't wear the wedding ring, but the rope had also disappeared. It seemed like a new version had branched out far apart from him. After Jackson was kidnapped, this new version may have been responsible for finding his wife, but what he had experienced was certainly completely different from the Jackson version of the family man. However, for his original wife, Daniela, after the kidnapping, countless versions of Jackson were born, and they were all identical. Previously, Amanda's best friend had encountered something similar, where she met another version of herself in a parallel world. The whole situation could be summarized in one sentence: the Jackson we are following is just one of the countless versions of Jackson that were separated after being kidnapped. This concept gives the viewers goosebumps, as the world is officially thrown into chaos. The man had just dealt with one person who was exactly like him and had attacked him, but then another version of himself appeared from the front. These people were like parasites in his life, invading it at the same time without warning. Jackson had traveled back to the world where he originally came from, entered a weapons store, bought a knife, and prepared to kill the scientist who had stolen his life. But, unexpectedly, as soon as he stepped out of the hotel, he encountered another version of himself at a crossroads. After being stunned for a moment, the two of them instinctively went in different directions, heading toward two separate staircases. Jackson realized that he wasn't the only one who had traveled to this world. He vaguely sensed that someone might be watching him. Following his instincts, he entered the familiar yet bustling Velistaff bar. To his surprise, he encountered another version of Jackson there. Both of them were filled with many questions, and they immediately sat down, deciding to talk things through. Unlike the man who wore a white ring, Jackson noticed that the version he met wore a black ring. He took the initiative to share his experience of being kidnapped by the scientist Jackson. At first, their stories were identical. They both woke up in the laboratory, and both were helped by Amanda to escape. However, from then on, every decision Jackson made inside the steel box created a different version of himself, and each of those versions had to face new choices. This cycle continued, leaving both of them feeling deeply disturbed. Despite the fact that many people suffered during this period, they couldn't help but feel the horror of it all. No matter what, this world was the final destination for all the Jacksons. Even though the success rate of reaching this world was only 1%, the number of versions of Jackson was beyond imagination. The two of them, in perfect harmony, decided to end this topic. When it came to Amanda, Jackson said that the Amanda he knew had stayed in a relatively perfect world. However, Amanda from Jackson's version, wearing a hat and bearing a scar on her face, wasn't so fortunate. They had experienced a dark world together, and Amanda unfortunately died there. Jackson, too, was severely injured and still hadn't fully recovered. The scarred Jackson suggested that they join forces to kill the scientist Jackson. In fact, he had already dug a grave in the suburbs. The original Jackson, however, thought of a harsh reality. There could only be one of them in this world. No matter which version of Jackson wanted to return to his life, he would have to eliminate all the others except for himself. Therefore, the idea of cooperating was impossible. As a result, their conversation ended in tension. At the same time, after returning home, the scientist Jackson was informed by his son that his wife had gone to visit Ryan, his close friend, and something seemed to have happened there. Jackson felt uneasy. Last night, Ryan had returned to this world, and he wondered if something had gone wrong. While taking out the trash, someone suddenly emerged from the shadows, holding a dagger, clearly with bad intentions. The scientist Jackson fought back with all his strength and eventually killed the attacker, only to find that it was another version of himself. He dragged the body into the parking lot, planning to wrap it up and dispose of it somewhere. Just as he was about to proceed, his son interrupted him. Jackson had no choice but to pretend nothing had happened and decided to put off dealing with it until later. That night, as he lay in bed, sleep eluded him. As the creator of the box, he knew that once one Jackson appeared, thousands or even millions of versions would follow. Meanwhile, his wife, Daniela, who was lying beside him, also couldn't sleep. When she went to visit her friend Ryan earlier, she noticed that he seemed to have become someone else entirely. Even he didn't know who she was, and he said that last night, while fixing her car, bar, he accidentally met a kind man who invited her for a drink. After he woke up, he found himself here. Donella quickly showed Ryan a picture of Jackson. Ryan nodded repeatedly, saying that the man was indeed the kind person from last night. Perhaps Donella still hadn't figured it out. To avoid police investigation, Jackson had kidnapped another Ryan from a parallel world and brought him here. However, it was certain that her current husband had some issues. Meanwhile, the original version of Jackson had just woken up on a park bench. He quickly came up with a way to defeat his competitor and walked into a cafe. He took out a cigar that he had prepared beforehand and casually lit it up, smoking as if no one was around. Despite the staff and customers clearly showing their displeasure, Jackson ignored them until the police arrived and put him in the patrol car. At this moment, Donella had just finished a shower and wanted to borrow her husband's car. However, he kept making excuses to refuse, so Donella had no choice to take a taxi back to the warehouse that Jack rented. She broke the lock to get inside. She had just entered when she saw the phone on the table, which contained many pictures of Jackson, in addition to a special box of medicine. Donella also noticed Ryan's jacket in the corner of the warehouse, which confirmed her suspicions were correct. Ryan's sudden disappearance was definitely related to Jackson. At that moment, her phone suddenly rang. It was the police station calling. At the same time, the scientist Jackson was leading his son on a tour of the university where he had once studied. It was the place where he and his wife, Donella, had met. Suddenly, from around the corner, a familiar figure appeared. Jackson was startled and quickly pulled his son toward the library. He hadn't expected that after just dealing with one Jackson, he would encounter another here. Scientist Jackson decided to use the crowd to shake off his pursuer, but the other Jackson kept following them. He had no choice but to send Charlie ahead and arranged to meet at the back door of the school. He then rushed up to the rooftop, hoping to find somewhere to hide, but the other Jackson was more persistent than he had imagined. With no other option left, the scientist Jackson circled around behind and attacked, noticing the black ring on his opponent's finger. This was probably the man he had met in the bar, the family man version of Jackson. Having been injured and still recovering, he was no match for the scientist Jackson. It didn't take long before he was strangled to death by the other Jackson, who had now killed two versions of himself in 2 days. The scientist Jackson's head felt like it was about to explode. He locked the body in a room, and as he rushed out, he coincidentally ran into Charlie, who was being interrogated by the police for parking in the wrong spot. After quickly explaining the situation to the officers, Charlie was finally able to leave. Meanwhile, the family man version of Charlie, after signing and submitting the paperwork, finally saw his wife, Donella, come to bail him out. Seeing her cold demeanor, Jackson hurriedly explained that he had purposely gotten himself arrested to create an opportunity for a private conversation with Donella. In fact, the last time they met was in the Velotap bar, where they celebrated Ryan. Donella thought her husband was talking nonsense, so he quickly tried to explain. Jackson quickly revealed the story about the scientist, Jackson discovering the iron box and creating a plan to steal his own life. Seeing Donella's shocked and confused expression, he said he had a way to prove it. He instructed Donella to call her current husband. Doubtful, she made the call, and sure enough, her husband's voice came through on the other end of the line. Donella's eyes widened in surprise. Jackson then told her to tell her husband that she wanted to go to the island where they had spent Christmas together the previous year. Donella knew they hadn't gone anywhere for Christmas last year, but she still repeated what Jackson said. On the other end, her husband cheerfully agreed, and even mentioned how beautiful the scenery was there. Donella stared at the man in front of her with disbelief, but she still couldn't accept the truth. At this moment, all she wanted was to find her son. Jackson, understanding her feelings, reassured her that he could help avoid any reckless actions from other versions of himself. He arranged the next meeting point and gave her a signal to identify him. After returning home, Donella quickly noticed something unusual. Clothes were scattered all over the bed. It turned out that the scientist Jackson intended to leave, which only further confirmed that he was an imposter. Now, he was beginning to show signs of wanting to escape. As Donella was about to remind her son, Jackson interrupted her. He told his wife to quickly pack their things and mentioned he would explain the reason on the way. Donella pretended to pack, secretly texting her son to leave as quickly as possible. However, he probably didn't check his phone. In a desperate situation, Donella asked her husband to go down to the basement with her to get some items. As he turned away, she pushed him with all her strength and quickly locked the basement door behind him. Donella urgently led her son to escape. On their way, they accidentally encountered Jackson, who came to pick them up. Without thinking, she immediately got into his car. However, this Jackson began telling her about how he had been replaced, and Donella instantly realized that the man in front of her was not Jackson. She immediately shouted for the car to stop, just as another car came speeding toward them. Luckily, neither Donella nor Charlie was injured. After getting out of the car, she saw yet another Jackson in the car that had just crashed into them. Donella and her son hurried to the subway station. The family man version of Jackson had been waiting there for a long time. After they exchanged the agreed-upon signal, the family was finally reunited. The movie ends here. Thank you for reading our film review. We hope that these insights have given you a new perspective on the film. Don't forget to like, share, and follow below to stay updated with the latest reviews. Thank you and see you again soon.